Chapter 6. The Press's Role, the Air Force Shrugs. The Grudge Report was supposedly not for general distribution. A few copies were sent to the Air Force press desk in the Pentagon, and reporters and writers could come in and read it. But a good many copies did get into circulation. The Air Force press room wasn't the best place to sit and study a 600-page report, and a quick glance at the report showed that it required some study, if no more than to find out what the authors were trying to prove. So several dozen copies got into circulation. I know that these liberated copies of the Grudge Report had been thoroughly studied because nearly every writer who came to ATIC during the time that I was in charge of Project Blue Book carried a copy. Since the press had some questions about the motives behind releasing the Grudge Report, it received very little publicity while the writers put out feelers. Consequently, in early 1950, you didn't read much about flying saucers. Evidently, certain people in the Air Force thought this lull in publicity meant that the UFOs had finally died, because Project Grudge was junked. All the project files, hundreds of pounds of reams, and other assorted bits of paper were unceremoniously yanked out of their filing cabinets, tied up with string, and chucked into an old storage case. I would guess that many reports ended up as souvenirs, because a year later, when I exhumed these files, there were a lot of reports missing. About this time, the official Air Force UFO project had one last post-death muscular spasm. The last bundle of reports had just landed on top of the pile of the storage case when ATIC received a letter from the Director of Intelligence of the Air Force. In official language, it said, "What gives?" There had been no order to end Project Grudge. The answer went back that Project Grudge had not been disbanded. The project functions had been transferred and it was no longer a special project. From now on, UFO reports would be processed through normal intelligence channels along with other intelligence reports. To show good faith, ATIC requested permission to issue a new Air Force-wide bulletin, which was duly mimeographed and disseminated. In essence, it said that Air Force Headquarters had directed ATIC to continue to collect and evaluate reports of unidentified flying objects. It went on to explain that most UFO reports were trash. It pointed out the findings of the Grudge Report in such strong language that by the time the recipient of the bulletin had finished reading it, he would be ashamed to send in a report. To cinch the deal, the bulletins must have been disseminated only to troops in Outer Mongolia, because I never found anyone in the field who had ever received a copy. As the Air Force UFO investigating activity dropped to nil, the press activity skyrocketed to a new peak. A dozen people took off to dig up their own UFO stories and to draw their own conclusions. After a quiet January, True again clobbered the reading public. This time it was a story in the March 1950 issue, and it was entitled, "How Scientists Tracked Flying Saucers." It was written by none other than the man who was at that time in charge of a team of Navy scientists at the Super Hush Hush Guided Missile Test and Development Area, White Sands Proving Ground, New Mexico. He was Commander R.B. McLaughlin, an Annapolis graduate and a regular Navy officer. His story had been cleared by the military and was in absolute 180-degree direct contradiction to every press release that had been made by the military in the past 2 years. Not only did the commander believe that he had proved that UFOs were real, but that he knew what they were. "I am convinced," he wrote in the True article, "that it, referring to a UFO he had seen at White Sands, was a flying saucer, and further, that these disks are spaceships from another planet, operated by animate, intelligent beings. On several occasions during 1948 and 1949, McLaughlin or his crew at the White Sands Proving Ground had made good UFO sightings. The best one was made on April 24, 1949, when the commander's crew of engineers, scientists, and technicians were getting ready to launch one of the huge 100-foot diameter skyhook balloons. It was 10:30 a.m. on an absolutely clear Sunday morning. Prior to the launching, the crew had sent up a small weather balloon to check the winds at lower levels. One man was watching the balloon through a theodolite, an instrument similar to a surveyor's transit built around a 25-power telescope. One man was holding a stopwatch, and a third had a clipboard to record the measured data. The crew had tracked the balloon to about 10,000 feet when one of them suddenly shouted and pointed off to the left. The whole crew looked at the part of the sky where the man was excitedly pointing, and there was a UFO. It didn't appear to be large, one of the scientists later said, but it was plainly visible. It was easy to see that it was elliptical in shape and had a whitish silver color. After taking a split second to realize what they were looking at, one of the men swung the theodolite around to pick up the object, and the timer reset his stopwatch. For 60 seconds they tracked the UFO as it moved toward the east. In about 55 seconds, it had dropped from an angle of elevation of 45 degrees to 25 degrees. Then it zoomed upward, and in a few seconds it was out of sight. The crew heard no sound, and the New Mexico desert was so calm that day that they could have heard a whisper a mile away. When they reduced the data they had collected, McLaughlin and crew found out that the UFO had been traveling 4 degrees per second. At one time during the observed portion of its flight, the UFO had passed in front of a range of mountains that were visible to the observers. Using this as a checkpoint, they estimated the size of the UFO to be 40 feet wide and 100 feet long, and they computed that the UFO had been at an altitude of 296,000 feet, or 56 miles, when they had first seen it, and that it was traveling 7 miles per second. This wasn't the only UFO sighting made by White Sands scientists. On April 5, 1948, another team watched a UFO for several minutes as it streaked across the afternoon skies. The disc-shaped object was about a fifth the size of a full moon. On another occasion, the crew of a C-47 that was tracking a skyhook balloon saw two similar UFOs come loping in from just above the horizon, circle the balloon, which was flying at just under 90,000 feet, and rapidly leave. When the balloon was recovered, it was ripped. I knew the two pilots of the C-47. Both of them now believe in flying saucers. And they aren't alone. So do the people of the Aeronautical Division of General Mills, who launch and track the big skyhook balloons. These scientists and engineers all have seen UFOs, and they aren't their own balloons. I was almost tossed out of the General Mills offices into a cold January Minneapolis snowstorm for suggesting such a thing, but that comes later in our history of the UFO. I don't know what these people saw. There has been a lot of interest generated by these sightings because of the extremely high qualifications and caliber of the observers. There is some legitimate doubt as to the accuracy of the speed and altitude figures that McLaughlin's crew arrived at from the data they measured with the theodolite. This doesn't mean much, however. Even if they were off by a factor of 100%, the speeds and altitudes would be fantastic. And besides, they looked at the UFO through a 25-power telescope and swore that it was a flat, oval-shaped object. Balloons, birds, and airplanes aren't flat and oval-shaped. Astrophysicist Dr. Donald Menzel, in a book entitled Flying Saucers, says they saw a refracted image of their own balloon caused by an atmospheric phenomenon. Maybe he is right, but the General Mills people don't believe it. And their disagreement is backed up by years of practical experience with the atmosphere, its tricks, and its illusions. When the March issue of True magazine, carrying Commander McLaughlin's story about how the White Sands scientists had tracked UFOs, reached the public, it stirred up a hornet's nest. Donald Kehoe's article in the January True had converted many people, but there were still a few heathens. The fact that government scientists had seen UFOs and were admitting it took care of a large percentage of these heathens. More and more people were believing in flying saucers. The Navy had no comment to make about the sightings, but they did comment on McLaughlin. It seems that several months before, at the suggestion of a group of scientists at White Sands, McLaughlin had carefully written up the details of the sightings and forwarded them to Washington. The report contained no personal opinions, just facts. The comments on McLaughlin's report had been wired back to White Sands from Washington, and they were, "What are you drinking out there?" A very intelligent answer, and it came from an admiral in the Navy's guided missile program. By the time his story was published, McLaughlin was no longer at White Sands. He was at sea on the destroyer Bristol. Maybe he answered the admiral's wire. The Air Force had no comment to make on McLaughlin's story. People at ATIC just shrugged and smiled as they walked by the remains of Project Grudge and continued to process UFO reports through regular intelligence channels. In early 1950, the UFOs moved down to Mexico. The newspapers were full of reports. Tourists were bringing back more saucer stories than hand-tooled genuine leather purses. Time reported that pickpockets were doing a fabulous business working the sky-gazing crowds that gathered when a plativolo was seen. Mexico's Department of National Defense reported that there had been some good reports, but that the stories of finding crashed saucers weren't true. On March 8th, one of the best UFO sightings of 1950 took place right over ATIC. About mid-morning on this date, a TWA airliner was coming into land at the Dayton Municipal Airport. As the pilot circled to get into the traffic pattern, he and his co-pilot saw a bright light hovering off to the southeast. The pilot called the tower operators at the airport to tell them about the light, but before he could say anything, the tower operators told him they were looking at it too. They had called the operations office of the Ohio Air National Guard,